It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, one of those calm, quiet days when the city seemed to breathe in unison with the soft hum of life. Elijah Turner, a man of modest height but an air of quiet confidence, stepped into the small cafe he had frequented for years. The scent of coffee and freshly baked pastries usually lifted his spirits. He had his usual spot, a cozy booth near the window, where he could look out at the street bustling with people heading to work or school. Today, he wore his usual friendly smile, nodding at a few familiar faces as he settled in and waited for service. But something felt off. He couldn't place it, but there was a tension in the air, a stiffness in the atmosphere that hadn't been there before. Elijah scanned the room, noticing the usual morning regulars, a mother with her toddler, a group of construction workers grabbing coffee to go, and elderly couples sharing their breakfast quietly. The staff were busy as usual, but he sensed glances, small, almost imperceptible glances directed his way. Brushing it off, he picked up the menu, though he already knew what he'd order, and waited. 10 minutes passed. Elijah watched as Tom, a younger waiter who had recently joined the cafe, buzzed around, taking orders from patrons who had arrived after him. Elijah thought maybe Tom was just overwhelmed, possibly even missed seeing him in the corner booth. He raised his hand slightly, offering a small nod and smile to catch Tom's attention. But Tom's gaze drifted over him, dismissing his silent request as he went about serving others. Elijah frowned, but his patience held firm. Maybe Tom was having a rough morning, and a wave of sympathy softened Elijah's expression. He decided he'd give it a bit more time. Another 10 minutes went by. Elijah shifted in his seat, a slight unease creeping in as he watched other tables get their orders while he still waited. He looked over, and this time, his patience was wearing thin. Tom walked past him, his eyes flickering over Elijah's presence without so much as a nod. The construction workers in the next booth overnoticed too, casting awkward glances between the waiter and Elijah. The mom across the way gave a sympathetic smile, and the elderly couple whispered amongst themselves. A strange tension began to settle over the room, as if everyone felt it, but no one dared to break the silence. By now, Elijah's patience was almost gone. It wasn't the wait that troubled him as much as the cold, deliberate disregard he felt. He watched Tom engage with other patrons, laughing lightly, offering friendly smiles, even recommending dishes to a few. But each time Elijah tried to make eye contact, he was met with nothing. It was as though he was invisible, a ghost in a place he'd been coming to for years. Something inside him twisted, an old pain resurfacing, one he thought he'd long buried. At that moment, Elijah made a decision. With a calm that surprised even himself, he raised his hand again and called out, his voice gentle but firm, "Excuse me, Tom. Could I get some service when you have a moment?" His words, though polite, seemed to echo in the cafe, drawing curious eyes from the nearby tables. Tom hesitated, a flicker of irritation crossing his face as he turned. He met Elijah's gaze for the first time, his expression hardening. "I'll be with you shortly," Tom replied curtly, barely concealing his impatience. Then, as if to punctuate his words, he turned his back once more and continued attending to other tables. Elijah's chest tightened as the subtle sting of the words settled in, leaving a bitter taste he hadn't anticipated. Minutes stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Elijah's discomfort grew, as did the weight of watching other patrons served and cared for while he was left in silence. The soft murmur of the cafe had changed, and there was an unmistakable air of tension. A few patrons looked away, uncomfortable. Others seemed frozen, waiting to see how this unusual scene would unfold. Elijah noticed Emma, the cafe's owner, standing behind the counter, glancing their way with a furrowed brow, watching Tom with a mix of concern and uncertainty. She seemed to realize that something was wrong, but she hadn't yet intervened. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Elijah stood up. The small gesture seemed to break an invisible dam. A few people murmured, and some even looked away, as if trying to avoid being part of what was happening. He stepped toward the counter, his steps deliberate, his expression calm but his gaze intense. The murmur of the cafe softened until it became a tense silence, all eyes drawn to this quiet man who had been ignored for reasons no one wanted to voice. As he reached the counter, he met Emma's gaze. Her eyes widened, and she looked between him and Tom, suddenly unsure. Elijah spoke, his voice soft but firm, carrying an undeniable strength. "I've been waiting for a while now," he said, his tone unwavering. "I'd just like to order a coffee and a bagel, if that's not too much trouble." Emma glanced nervously at Tom, who had gone pale. She opened her mouth to respond. But before she could speak, a voice from the back of the cafe called out, "This is unbelievable. You've been ignoring him this whole time." It was the young mother, her voice rising in quiet outrage. Her toddler, oblivious, played with his toy as she shot an accusatory look toward Tom. The crowd stirred, and soon another voice spoke up, this time one of the construction workers. "Yeah, we've been watching you ignore him. Not a good look, man." His voice, though casual, carried a clear note of disapproval, echoing the thoughts of several patrons who had witnessed the entire ordeal. Emma, flustered, tried to regain control. "I apologize, Mr. Turner. There must have been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice wavering as she avoided looking directly at him. But Elijah didn't move, didn't flinch. His calm, steady gaze remained fixed on Tom, who now looked deeply uncomfortable. "No misunderstanding," Elijah replied softly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the entire room. "I don't know why I was ignored, but it's clear it wasn't accidental." Tom swallowed, his face flushed, glancing around at the uncomfortable faces in the room. He shifted on his feet, looking down. The bravado and dismissive attitude from earlier vanished. Just as the tension threatened to crack, a young woman sitting by the window discreetly lifted her phone, capturing the scene unfolding in the cafe. She posted it online within minutes, unaware of how the video would spark conversations that would reach far beyond the quiet walls of this cafe. Elijah, though unaware of the video, stood firm, his silent strength and resilience quietly impacting everyone in the room. Emma, realizing the gravity of the situation, took a deep breath and finally addressed Tom directly. "You can go on break, Tom." Now, her voice, though steady, carried a finality that left no room for argument. Tom left without a word, the humiliation apparent on his face. Elijah looked at Emma, his expression softening slightly, yet holding a quiet resolve. "Thank you, Emma," he said simply, his tone calm but carrying the weight of a much deeper message. He returned to his seat as the cafe resumed its hum. Though the tension lingered, the air charged with an unspoken understanding that something significant had just happened. As he finally received his coffee, Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. It was a small victory, one of many he'd fought in silence. But this time, the world had witnessed it, and soon they would be forced to reckon with it. The ripples of this quiet stand would spread further than anyone could have anticipated, changing lives and altering perspectives, all because one man refused to be invisible. The following morning, Elijah woke to an unusual number of messages and missed calls on his phone. He rubbed his eyes, squinting at the screen as notification after notification popped up. Most were from friends, a few from colleagues at the high school where he taught, and some from numbers he didn't recognize. Confused, he scrolled through the messages. Each one referenced the cafe incident in some way, and many expressed outrage, support, or curiosity. Elijah was still piecing it together when his sister, Lena, called. "Elijah, have you seen the video?" Lena's voice was breathless, like she'd been holding back a whirlwind of thoughts just for him. "Video." Elijah was taken aback, still trying to adjust to the fact that the uncomfortable moment he'd experienced had somehow taken on a life of its own. "What video?" Lena sighed, her tone filled with a mix of frustration and sadness. Someone recorded what happened at the cafe yesterday. It's all over social media, Elijah. People are talking about it like crazy. A pit formed in his stomach. Elijah was a private man who valued his role as a teacher and mentor, but he had never sought the spotlight. The cafe incident had been a moment of quiet defiance, a stand he had taken for himself. He had never intended for it to become a public spectacle, let alone a viral sensation. He felt exposed, as though a deeply personal experience had been transformed into a public story for strangers to dissect. Reluctantly, he opened his social media app. The video was right there on his feed, shared by dozens of people in his network, along with hundreds of comments. He watched in muted shock as his own face appeared on the screen, his calm words to Tom resonating with a quiet but undeniable power. The young mother's voice, chastising Tom for ignoring him, echoed through his phone speakers. The video had been shared widely, accompanied by hashtags demanding accountability, discussing racial discrimination, and expressing outrage on Elijah's behalf. For a moment, he was frozen. The comments under the video were a torrent of emotions: support, anger, disappointment, even disbelief. Some people expressed solidarity, sharing their own experiences of discrimination, while others lashed out at Tom and the cafe, calling for boycotts and demanding apologies. A few questioned whether the incident had been blown out of proportion, wondering if it was really about race or just a mistake. But the overwhelming sentiment was one of support, strangers from all over expressing their anger over how he had been treated. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts, and when he opened it, he was greeted by his neighbor, Miss Trudy, a retiree who had always treated Elijah like family. She held a newspaper in her hands, her face lit up with a mixture of concern and pride. "Elijah, I don't know if you've seen this yet, but they mentioned you in the paper this morning." She handed him the newspaper, her eyes scanning his face for a reaction. There, in the local news section, was an article titled "Cafe Incident Sparks Dialogue on Discrimination in Our Community." His name wasn't mentioned directly, but it was clear that he was the man in question. Elijah's face softened as he read, taking in the words carefully. The article recounted the incident, painting him as a quiet but firm advocate for dignity and respect, a man who had stood his ground in the face of subtle discrimination. The journalist's tone was empathetic, expressing that this one incident had forced the town to confront an issue that often went unspoken. "Looks like you've become a bit of a local hero," Ms. Trudy said with a small smile, patting him gently on the arm. "People are finally talking about things they've ignored for too long. I'm proud of you, Elijah." Her words were meant to reassure him, but they felt heavy, almost daunting. Elijah hadn't set out to be anyone's hero. He was just a teacher, a brother, a son, a neighbor. He hadn't wanted to make waves or change the world in some grand, sweeping gesture. He just wanted his coffee, his bagel, and a peaceful morning. But now he found himself standing at the center of something much larger than he had ever anticipated. As the day went on, Elijah's phone continued to buzz, and he was approached by people around town, offering kind words and encouragement. Some students from his school even stopped him on the street, thanking him for standing up and telling him that he had inspired them. Elijah felt both humbled and uneasy. He appreciated their support, but he feared the unintended consequences that this attention might bring. He didn't want Tom to lose his job, or for the cafe to suffer, and he certainly didn't want his actions to be seen as a condemnation of every employee there. But the tide of public opinion had a life of its own, and there was little he could do to stop it. That evening, just as he was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the whirlwind of attention, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, he was met by Emma, the cafe owner. She looked weary, her face etched with the strain of the past day. She held a small gift-wrapped package and wore an expression that was a mix of regret and sincerity. "Elijah, I wanted to come by in person," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't tell you how sorry I am for what happened yesterday. I should have stepped in sooner. I saw it happening. And, well, I failed you. I failed to protect the respect and dignity of my customers, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Elijah studied her face, seeing the genuine remorse in her eyes. He could tell that this incident had affected her as well, forcing her to confront the biases and complacency that had allowed someone like Tom to act as he had. She handed him the small package, which he opened to find a beautifully crafted, personalized mug. Inscribed on it were the words, "Strength in Silence," a reminder of the quiet power he had shown in the face of mistreatment. "Thank you, Emma," he replied softly, touched by her gesture. He saw in her a reflection of the same growth and introspection that he himself was experiencing. "I appreciate this. I know this hasn't been easy for you, either." They talked for a while, discussing the changes she planned to make in her cafe, including sensitivity training for her staff and an emphasis on creating a more inclusive environment. Elijah listened, offering his support and guidance, realizing that perhaps this was an opportunity not just for him, but for the entire community to grow and learn. As they said their goodbyes, Elijah felt a sense of peace, as though the storm was finally beginning to calm. But that peace was short-lived. Later that night, just as he was settling down to sleep, his phone rang. It was Lena again, her voice urgent and panicked. "Elijah, I just saw something online," she said, her tone frantic. "Tom, he posted a video, calling you out, saying you ruined his life. He's blaming you for everything, claiming he's been harassed, and that you've turned everyone against him. He's trying to twist the story, Elijah." Elijah sat up, his heart sinking as he processed her words. He had hoped that the situation could be resolved peacefully, but now it seemed that Tom was taking matters into his own hands, determined to cast himself as the victim. As he scrolled through his feed, he saw Tom's video, filled with accusations and anger, painting Elijah as the villain who had unjustly destroyed his life over a simple misunderstanding. In that moment, Elijah realized that his decision to stand up for himself had set off a chain reaction he could never have anticipated. The story was no longer his alone. It had become a battleground of perspectives, a clash between those who saw his actions as an act of courage and those who viewed him as an instigator, a man who had used his influence to ruin another's life. The events of the past 2 days weighed heavily on his heart as he considered what to do next. He could defend himself, share his side of the story once more, or he could let the world interpret it as they wished. But as he lay there, the silence of the night around him, he felt a quiet resolve building within. Whatever he chose, he knew that his life, and perhaps his community, would never be the same again. The fallout from Tom's videos spread quickly. By the next morning, Elijah found himself caught in an even larger storm, one that seemed determined to distort the simple truth of what had happened. The cafe incident had been transformed, exaggerated, reshaped by people who didn't know him, people who only saw the labels, the headlines, the sensationalism. Elijah, once a man simply waiting for his morning coffee, was now at the center of a narrative that was pulling his life apart at the seams. As he scrolled through comments online, he saw the venom of anonymous critics, the supporters who defended him, and others who sympathized with Tom, convinced he was a victim of an overblown situation. It was all too much, yet Elijah couldn't look away. He was no longer just a man waiting for breakfast in a small-town cafe. He had become a symbol, and with that, a target. News outlets had picked up on the story, and articles appeared with titles like "Local Man Faces Backlash After Confronting Waiter" and "Town Cafe Divided. Whose side are you on?" Every corner of his life was affected. He found students from his school looking at him differently, some in awe, some in quiet curiosity. He could feel the weight of expectation on him, their silent hope that he would handle this storm with the same quiet strength they had seen in him in the classroom. Parents approached him, some offering their support, others politely withdrawing from conversations, avoiding the now public figure he had become. Even his principal pulled him aside to cautiously inquire how he was doing, her careful wording hinting at concerns over the school's reputation. His family, too, felt the impact. Lena was fierce in her defense of him, tirelessly responding to online comments, determined to make sure the truth was told. His mother, however, was worried, urging him to consider how all this public attention might affect his job, his relationships, his future. Elijah appreciated her concern, but he felt an unshakable duty to stand by what had happened, to acknowledge the incident as more than a simple misunderstanding. It was an opportunity to face down years of subtle prejudices, but he had never expected the path forward to be this complicated. 2 days later, a community meeting was called at the local town hall. To Elijah's surprise, the town council wanted to discuss the cafe incident directly, concerned about the division it had caused and the wave of attention their small town was suddenly receiving. The mayor, a typically soft-spoken man named Roger Hale, had personally requested Elijah attend. Although reluctant, Elijah agreed, recognizing that the situation had grown beyond him. If he didn't attend, he knew the rumors and assumptions would only escalate. The hall was packed with residents from all over town, an unusual turnout for a simple council meeting. Conversations filled the air as people waited for the meeting to begin, their voices a strange mixture of support, curiosity, and quiet animosity. Elijah spotted familiar faces. Ms. Trudy was seated near the front, her gaze warm but worried. Emma, the cafe owner, sat nearby, her face pale, hands clasped tightly on her lap. And there, at the back, stood Tom, his eyes fixed ahead, expression unreadable, a dark tension clouding his presence. Roger Hale opened the meeting with a brief speech, expressing his regret over the recent divisions that had surfaced and stressing the importance of unity. Then, after a few procedural updates, he turned to Elijah and gestured for him to stand. The hall quieted, all eyes on him, as if he held the answers to every question, every doubt, every whisper that had lingered in the air since the incident. Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the pressure of every gaze on him. He chose his words carefully, his voice steady as he began. I want to start by saying that I never intended for any of this to happen. I went to the cafe that day as I always have, simply wanting to enjoy a quiet breakfast. He paused, the weight of his own words settling over him. What happened? I think we all know it wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was about dignity, respect, basic decency. No one should have to feel invisible, no matter who they are or where they come from. Murmurs rippled through the audience, some nodding in agreement, others whispering to each other. He could feel both support and doubt in the room, a delicate balance that hung on his every word. But I also don't want to see our town ripped apart over this, Elijah continued. I don't want Tom to lose his job, nor do I want the cafe to suffer. We all have a part to play in making this community a place of respect and understanding, and that's all I was trying to express that day. At this, Tom stood abruptly, his face a mask of anger and frustration. You're saying that now, but look at what's happened because of you. His voice shook, resonating through the hall. You've turned everyone against me. My life is ruined because of your little stand for dignity. Do you have any idea what I'm going through? The crowd was silent, caught off guard by the raw emotion in his voice. Elijah felt a pang of empathy, unexpected but real, as he looked at Tom. He could see the fear in his eyes, the vulnerability behind the bravado. In that moment, he realized that Tom wasn't just angry. He was scared, perhaps for the first time forced to confront the consequences of his own actions. I'm not here to ruin anyone's life, Tom, Elijah replied, his tone gentle. But sometimes, facing the truth can feel like that. We're all responsible for how we treat each other. It's not just about me, and it's not just about you. It's about all of us learning from this. The mayor cleared his throat, sensing the tension and stepping in to calm the room. Thank you, Elijah, he said, his voice steady. Now let's hear from Emma, the cafe owner. Emma rose from her seat, her face strained with remorse. I want to apologize to you, Elijah, and to the community. I failed to act when I should have, and for that, I take full responsibility. I promise that going forward, I will ensure that my staff is trained to uphold respect for every person who walks through our doors." The crowd murmured again, some voices filled with forgiveness, others still holding on to anger. But amidst the quiet exchange of words, Elijah felt a shift, a small, almost imperceptible softening in the atmosphere. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a turning point, an unspoken agreement that the town together could do better. After Emma finished speaking, Roger Hale opened the floor to the community, inviting anyone to share their thoughts. One by one, people came forward, some sharing stories of their own experiences with discrimination, others expressing their frustration over the intense attention the town had received. An elderly woman spoke about how she'd lived in the town her whole life and had always hoped they'd be a welcoming place for all people. A young man mentioned that he, too, had felt the sting of prejudice, but had never had the courage to speak up. The conversation became a catharsis, a long overdue dialogue that had been buried under layers of politeness and unspoken tension. Elijah listened, moved by the honesty pouring out from his neighbors, feeling as though a small piece of his own burden was lifting with every word. He hadn't realized how deeply rooted these issues were, how many people in his community had been affected by similar experiences, and how desperately they had needed a moment like this to finally be heard. As the meeting drew to a close, Roger turned to Elijah one last time. "Thank you, Elijah, for having the courage to bring this issue to light. It may not have been easy, but I believe you've given us all a chance to become a stronger, more understanding community." Elijah nodded, feeling both humbled and exhausted. The weight of responsibility was still there, but it was lighter now, shared with the many voices he had heard that evening. He could see the path forward, a journey that would not be without its challenges, but one that he was now ready to face. As he left the town hall, people approached him, some shaking his hand, others simply offering a supportive nod. Tom remained in the background, watching silently, his expression unreadable. Elijah wondered if, in time, even Tom might come to see things differently. As he walked home, Elijah felt a sense of peace that he hadn't expected. This incident had opened wounds, but it had also offered the chance for healing, for growth, for change. He knew the road ahead would be long, that not everyone would be ready to change overnight, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet strength that would guide him in the days to come. The stars shone bright above him as he stepped into the night, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always light to be found. And as he looked up, he knew that this story was far from over. It was only the beginning of a journey toward something greater, a journey he was now ready to embrace, for himself and for everyone in his community. In the days following the town hall meeting, the dust seemed to settle a little. People continued with their daily lives, but there was an undeniable shift in the town's atmosphere. Conversations that had once been whispers and side glances were now openly discussed at barbershops, on street corners, and around family dinner tables. The incident at the cafe had sparked something deeper, a collective reckoning that people couldn't ignore. For Elijah, the whirlwind of attention had died down somewhat, but he still felt its effects rippling through every part of his life. He returned to work at the high school, hoping for a semblance of normalcy. His students greeted him with an eagerness he hadn't expected. They looked at him with newfound admiration, as if he had somehow transformed into a hero overnight. Elijah didn't feel like a hero, though. He was just a man who had chosen not to remain silent. But he knew he couldn't ignore the opportunity to turn this moment into a teaching lesson. One afternoon, as his class sat quietly, waiting for him to begin the lesson, Elijah closed his textbook and looked around the room. He could feel the anticipation in the air, the unasked questions in his students' eyes. Clearing his throat, he spoke with a calm but resonant tone. "I know many of you have heard about what happened at the cafe, and I know some of you have your own thoughts and opinions about it. So today, instead of our usual lesson, let's have an honest conversation." The room went silent. His students shifted in their seats, surprised by the sudden invitation to speak freely. Slowly, One of the students, a quiet girl named Maya, raised her hand. "Mr. Turner, did you expect all of this to happen? Did you know it would become such a big deal?" Elijah shook his head, his face softening. "No, Maya, I didn't. In fact, I would have been happy if it had all ended that day in the cafe. I was just a customer trying to get a meal, like anyone else. But sometimes standing up for yourself can have unexpected consequences, and sometimes those consequences aren't just about you. They affect everyone around you." Another student, Jason, a boy who usually kept to himself, spoke up. "My dad said that you're brave, that you did something a lot of people wouldn't have done. He said he's seen things like that happen before, but no one ever says anything." Elijah listened, feeling the weight of Jason's words. He knew how much courage it took for people like Jason's father to live through experiences of discrimination without speaking up. The silence, the internalized pain, was something Elijah had known all too well. "Jason, your dad isn't alone. Many people experience things they shouldn't have to, and it takes a lot of strength to get through that without saying a word. But it also takes strength to speak up, even when you don't know how people will respond." As more students joined the conversation, sharing stories of their own or of friends and family who had experienced subtle and overt acts of prejudice, Elijah felt a deep sense of connection forming in the room. These were students who had come from all walks of life, each with their own stories and struggles, and yet they found a common thread in their shared humanity. For once, it felt like the walls of silence were breaking down, allowing real voices to rise, unfiltered and honest. Later that evening, Elijah stopped by his sister Lena's place, feeling emotionally drained but grateful for the moments of vulnerability he had shared with his students. Lena greeted him at the door, her expression a mixture of concern and pride. "You're doing good work, Eli. It's not just the students or the town that's changing. You're changing too." Elijah smiled, giving her a warm hug. "I never planned on any of this, Lena. I just wanted a cup of coffee," he said, chuckling softly, but his tone held a deeper sincerity. "But now I realize that this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has ever felt invisible, everyone who's ever been treated differently because of something they can't control." They sat down to dinner, a quiet meal punctuated by shared glances and comfortable silences. Lena was his anchor, the one person who had been by his side through every storm. She could sense his exhaustion but knew he was far from finished. This was just the beginning of a journey he had unknowingly stepped into, a journey that was no longer just about himself. As they finished their meal, Lena's phone buzzed on the table, vibrating with an alert that made her eyes widen. She glanced at Elijah, a hint of trepidation in her gaze. "It's from Tom," she said, almost reluctantly, her voice tinged with worry. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen or heard from Tom since the town hall meeting. The last image he had of him was the expression of anger and frustration in Tom's eyes as he accused Elijah of ruining his life. Part of him had hoped that Tom would take the time to reflect on what had happened, but he wasn't sure if that hope was realistic. Still, he nodded, urging Lena to read the message. Lena opened the message, her brow furrowing as she read aloud. "He wants to meet with you, Eli. Says he has something to get off his chest, something he wants you to hear." She paused, looking up at him with a mixture of uncertainty and caution. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Elijah took a deep breath, weighing his options. He knew he could ignore the request, let the past stay in the past, and move forward without reopening old wounds. But something inside him stirred, a sense of unfinished business, a lingering question that he couldn't shake. If Tom was reaching out, maybe it meant he was ready to face the truth, or maybe it meant he was looking for another way to blame Elijah. Either way, Elijah felt compelled to hear him out. The next evening, they arranged to meet at a quiet park on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes and curious ears. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the park as Elijah approached the bench where Tom was seated, his posture tense, his gaze fixed on the ground. Elijah hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down beside him, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant laughter of children playing, and the soft chirping of birds settling in for the night. Finally, Tom cleared his throat, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Elijah turned to him, surprise flickering in his eyes. He hadn't expected an apology, not from Tom. He had prepared himself for anger, for resentment, for a continuation of the bitterness he had seen in Tom's eyes before. But the man sitting next to him now seemed different, subdued, almost vulnerable. "I was angry," Tom continued, his voice trembling slightly. I thought you were just trying to make me look bad, to ruin my life. But after everything that's happened, after seeing how people reacted, I started to realize that maybe it wasn't just about me. Maybe I was wrong." Elijah listened, feeling a mixture of relief and empathy. He could sense the struggle in Tom's words, the resistance he had likely felt as he tried to confront his own actions. This was a man who had been forced to look in the mirror and see a version of himself he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "It took a lot to say that." Elijah replied gently. "I know it's not easy to face things like this, especially when it feels like the whole world is watching. But I didn't stand up that day just for myself. I did it for everyone who has ever felt less than, who has ever been overlooked or ignored. We all deserve respect, Tom, and sometimes that respect has to be earned by acknowledging our mistakes." Tom nodded, his gaze still fixed on the ground. "I know. And I know I've got a lot to make up for. I just didn't know how to start. I've been so used to blaming others, to seeing things a certain way, that it never even occurred to me that maybe I was part of the problem." A silence settled between them, but it was a different silence, one filled with understanding rather than tension. Elijah felt a sense of closure, a release of the burden he had carried since that day in the cafe. He knew that Tom's journey was far from over, that he would have to work hard to rebuild his life and reputation, but he also knew that everyone deserved a chance to grow, to change, to become better. They sat there until the sky darkened, their conversation fading into the quiet of the evening. When they finally parted ways, Elijah felt a profound sense of peace, a rare and precious feeling that he had come to value more than ever. This experience had changed him, had shaped him in ways he hadn't anticipated. And now, as he looked out over his town, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to the community that had supported him and challenged him. In the weeks that followed, Tom began volunteering at local community centers, participating in diversity training, and speaking openly about his mistakes. He became an unexpected advocate for change, a man who had once resisted growth, but had ultimately embraced it. Elijah watched from a distance, proud of the transformation but content to let Tom find his own way. And though life gradually returned to its rhythm, the town was never quite the same. The cafe incident became a story people shared with their children. The weeks passed, and life in the town settled into a quiet rhythm, but something intangible had shifted. Elijah noticed it in the way people looked at him, in the cautious nods of respect from strangers, the knowing glances exchanged by longtime residents, and the hushed conversations that sometimes went silent as he walked by. The cafe incident, as people now called it, had become a permanent part of the town's collective memory. Everyone knew the story, and while it wasn't often discussed openly, it had left a mark, a reminder that even small actions could ignite significant change. The town council took the story seriously, implementing new policies to promote inclusivity, not just in businesses, but in schools and public spaces. Local businesses began hosting diversity and sensitivity training, not just as a formality, but as a genuine step toward progress. Meanwhile, Elijah continued his quiet role as a teacher, but his presence in the classroom took on new meaning. His students saw him differently now, not just as their teacher, but as someone who had stood up for respect and dignity. He was a living example of the courage they read about in history books, and his influence ran deeper than ever before. One Thursday morning, Elijah sat at his desk, grading assignments, when the school principal knocked softly on his door. Principal Harris was a tall, elegant woman with a calm but authoritative demeanor. She held a folder under her arm, but her expression was kind, almost hopeful. "Elijah, do you have a moment?" she asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Of course, Principal Harris," he replied, setting his pen down and gesturing for her to sit. She took a seat across from him, a smile forming on her lips as she looked at him with an appreciative gaze. "I wanted to talk to you about something," she began, her voice measured. "Your actions over the past few weeks have sparked a lot of change, and I think it's time we recognize that, officially." Elijah tilted his head, surprised. "I didn't do anything special, Principal. I was just trying to stand up for myself and for what's right." Principal Harris shook her head. "What you did matters, Elijah. It's impacted not just our school, but the entire community. People look up to you. You've set an example, and I believe that our students could benefit from learning more about what it means to stand up for respect and integrity." She handed him the folder she'd been holding. Inside was a proposal, a curriculum for a new elective course centered on social justice, ethics, and community engagement. Principal Harris wanted him to teach it, to use his experience and insight to help guide young minds in understanding the importance of empathy, courage, and respect. "I know it's a lot to consider," she continued, sensing his hesitation. "But this could be something special. The students are already inspired by you, and I think you'd be the perfect person to lead this course." Elijah looked down at the folder, his mind racing with the possibilities. The idea of shaping a new generation, of giving his students the tools to understand and navigate complex issues, filled him with a sense of purpose. This wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to leave a lasting impact, to make a difference in a way he hadn't considered before. "Thank you, Principal Harris," he replied, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "I'd be honored to take this on." The news of the new course spread quickly, and by the time Elijah stepped into his classroom to announce it, there was already a buzz of excitement. Students eagerly signed up, drawn not just by the course content, but by the chance to learn from someone they now saw as a role model. Elijah felt a renewed sense of pride and commitment as he prepared to teach them about history, ethics, and the power of standing up for what's right. The first day of the new class arrived, and Elijah stood before his students, each of them watching him with curiosity and anticipation. He began by sharing the story of the cafe incident, recounting it not as a tale of personal victory, but as a lesson on the importance of dignity and respect. He spoke openly about the fear, the uncertainty, and the weight of responsibility he had felt, and the students listened, captivated by his honesty. His story became a starting point for discussions on empathy, equality, and the importance of seeing people as individuals rather than labels. But the impact of Elijah's story extended far beyond the classroom. Inspired by his actions and the new course, students began organizing community events, partnering with local organizations to support diversity initiatives, and volunteering in local outreach programs. The town transformed in ways Elijah hadn't anticipated as a new wave of young leaders emerged, each determined to carry on the values he had exemplified. As the weeks turned into months, the cafe incident faded from daily conversation, but its legacy lingered. Tom, the waiter whose actions had ignited the entire ordeal, became a frequent face at these community events, volunteering his time and working alongside others to promote understanding and respect. He and Elijah spoke occasionally, their conversations brief but filled with a mutual understanding. They would never be close friends, but they had come to an unspoken agreement to move forward, each in his own way. One afternoon, as Elijah walked through the park on his way home, he saw Tom working at a food drive organized by the local community center. Tom was carrying boxes of canned goods, his face focused and intent. Elijah watched him from a distance, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. The incident had changed both of them, but perhaps it had changed Tom the most, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had ignored for too long. Later that evening, Elijah received a message from a former student who had graduated years ago. The message was simple, but it touched him deeply. "Mr. Turner, I just wanted you to know that what you did inspired me. I'm studying to be a social worker now because of you. Thank you for showing me what it means to stand up for what's right." Elijah sat in silence, his heart swelling with pride and humility. He had never sought out the role of a hero or a leader, but somehow, that's exactly what he had become. His journey had started with a simple act of defiance, a refusal to be invisible, and it had blossomed into something much larger than he had ever imagined. Reflecting on the past months, he realized that his quiet stand in the cafe had set off a series of events that had transformed not only his own life, but the lives of countless others. His story had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that even small acts of courage could create ripples that reached far beyond the individual. He thought of his students, his community, and the future that lay ahead. And for the first time, he felt at peace, knowing that he had done his part to make the world just a little bit better. As he gazed out his window, watching the evening settle over the town, he thought of how his story might inspire others in ways he would never fully know. He knew that life would continue with its challenges and triumphs, but he was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. He had faced down prejudice, he had found strength in silence, and he had shown his community the power of respect and dignity. And in doing so, he had discovered a deeper truth, that sometimes the most extraordinary change begins with an ordinary person who refuses to back down. Months had passed since the incident at the cafe, but the effects of that day continued to unfold, weaving into the fabric of the town's daily life. People went about their routines, yet there was a subtle but profound transformation that lingered, a quiet understanding that things were different now. For Elijah, the story had evolved from a single moment of standing up for himself into a journey that had reshaped not just his life, but the lives of so many around him. One Saturday morning, Elijah was invited to speak at a town forum hosted by the local community center. The event aimed to bring people together to discuss issues of equality, unity, and how to foster a more inclusive community. The invitation had surprised him. After all, he'd never considered himself a public speaker, but he understood that his story had become a symbol of resilience and respect, a message that still resonated in the hearts of his neighbors. So he agreed, prepared his notes, and dressed in his best suit, ready to face a room full of people seeking guidance, inspiration, or perhaps just a deeper understanding of the town's journey toward healing. As he arrived at the community center, Elijah was greeted by familiar faces and strangers alike. Ms. Trudy, his elderly neighbor who had supported him from the beginning, gave him a warm smile as he passed by. She held his hand tightly, whispering, "We're all so proud of you, Elijah. Thank you for showing us the way." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze and smiled. There were nods of encouragement from others as he made his way toward the front of the room, his heart pounding, but his resolve steady. The forum was packed, filled with people of all ages, backgrounds, and beliefs. Some of his students sat near the front, their eyes wide with admiration. To his surprise, he even saw Tom seated toward the back, his expression solemn but attentive. Elijah felt a strange sense of peace in seeing him there, a sign that perhaps Tom had truly begun his own path of understanding and growth. When it was time for him to speak, Elijah stepped up to the podium, his hands resting on the edges as he scanned the room. The silence was palpable, the weight of everyone's anticipation hanging in the air. He took a deep breath and began. "I never set out to be here," he said, his voice calm but resonant. "I never wanted to be the center of a story like this. I was just a man trying to enjoy a cup of coffee. But that day in the cafe became something much larger than I could have ever imagined. It became a moment that forced me to look at who I was, and it forced this town to look at who we all are." He paused, letting his words settle. Standing up for myself wasn't easy. In that moment, I felt fear, anger, and a deep sadness. But I also felt something stronger, something that told me I couldn't stay silent. I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable, but I also didn't want to be invisible. And I think that's something we all understand in our own way. We all want to be seen, to be respected, to be treated with dignity. Elijah went on to share the lessons he had learned from the experience, not as a sermon but as an honest reflection on the journey he had undergone. He spoke about the power of small actions, about how a single stand can ripple outwards and touch lives in ways we may never fully see. He shared how his students had inspired him to keep going, to hold on to hope even when things felt overwhelming. And he spoke of the courage it took not only to speak up but to listen, to open our hearts and minds to the experiences of others. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him, every person drawn in by his quiet strength. And then, to his surprise, Tom rose from his seat at the back of the room. He cleared his throat, his face a mixture of resolve and regret. The crowd shifted, whispers rippling through the audience as they recognized him. Tom took a hesitant step forward, and then another, until he was standing near the front, looking directly at Elijah. "I know I'm probably the last person who should be speaking," Tom began, his voice thick with emotion. "But I feel like I need to say this here in front of all of you. I made a terrible mistake that day. I let my own ignorance, my own prejudices, cloud my judgment, and it hurt someone who deserved so much better. Elijah gave me the grace to realize my mistakes and to try to make things right. And I know I can never fully undo the harm I caused, but I'm here today to say that I'm trying, every single day, to be a better person." A murmur of surprise swept through the crowd, but as Tom continued to speak, his sincerity cut through any lingering resentment. He spoke of his journey since that day, the introspection, the pain, and the gradual awakening to the depth of his own biases. Tom admitted that he was still learning, still growing, but he wanted everyone to know that he was committed to doing the work. He apologized, not only to Elijah but to the entire community, acknowledging that his actions had hurt more than one person. They had affected everyone who called this town home. When Tom finished, Elijah felt a profound sense of closure. He stepped down from the podium and extended his hand to Tom. For a brief moment, the two men stood there, shaking hands, a quiet understanding passing between them. The room erupted in applause, not just for Elijah or for Tom, but for the healing, the growth, the possibility of transformation that their story now represented. After the forum, people approached Elijah, expressing their gratitude, their admiration, their own stories of hardship and resilience. Miss Trudy, teary-eyed and smiling, hugged him tightly. "You've done something incredible here, Elijah," she said. "You've shown us all that change is possible, that respect and understanding are within our reach." Elijah nodded, feeling both humbled and fulfilled. He knew that the journey was far from over, that there would still be challenges, misunderstandings, moments of hardship, but he also knew that his story, now their story, had given people a reason to hope, a reason to believe in the power of small, meaningful actions. The forum had brought the town together in a way he hadn't thought possible, and he felt a renewed commitment to the people around him, to his community, to the idea that we are all, ultimately, responsible for one another. Over the following weeks, Elijah continued to teach his social justice course, guiding his students through discussions on empathy, ethics, and community. The class had become one of the most popular in the school, drawing students from all backgrounds who were eager to learn, to engage, to build a better future. Elijah watched them with pride, knowing that they were the ones who would carry forward the lessons of his story, each in their own way. And as the seasons changed and time moved forward, the story of the cafe incident became part of the town's lore, a reminder of a pivotal moment when one man's quiet stand had sparked a journey of growth for everyone involved. The cafe itself underwent a transformation, with Emma, the owner, dedicating a section of the wall to local art and stories of resilience, a space where people could share their own experiences and perspectives. She named it the Corner of Courage, a tribute to Elijah's bravery, and to the courage it takes for anyone to speak up. One afternoon, Elijah stopped by the cafe and saw his own photo on the wall, a small plaque beneath it that read, "In recognition of Elijah Turner, whose strength in silence helped change our town for the better." He smiled, feeling a warmth that radiated from his heart. The cafe was buzzing with life, filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, each of them a part of the tapestry of the town that had grown stronger, richer, more compassionate because of one small but significant stand. As he sipped his coffee, Elijah thought about the journey he'd been on, the unexpected twists, the challenges, the growth. He thought about Tom, who had come so far, and his students, who held the future in their hands. He knew he'd done his part, but he also understood that this was only the beginning. There would always be more to learn, more to understand, more bridges to build. And he was ready, willing, and eager to keep walking that path, one quiet step at a time. And as he sat there, watching the town move forward, Elijah felt a deep, abiding peace, knowing that he had played a part in something truly meaningful, something that would echo for years to come.